My name is Cade. I am a I'm a designer and a researcher. And I won't talk too much about myself, but I think it's good to have a little bit of context as to why I'm here and what this is all about. I've been a designer for 10 years. I've worked across industries, from big financial companies through to nonprofits, through to blockchains, blockchain companies and apps and things like that. And in my work over the past 10 years, I've kind of noticed a recurring theme, both in the teams that I worked in, and then also in the greater public life. And that is that there was something wrong really between what we were doing and the outcomes that we had. So we had this idea that things would be a certain kind of way, and then we would launch something and we would find on a very small level that in many cases that wasn't the case. And that's true of all design, right? Because we have this idea that, even though we have user testing and user stories and things like that, it doesn't usually, features don't work properly or things like that, and we have to revise those. But what I was finding was that more than that, we were getting sort of these social problems too. And as the internet kind of became more and more mainstream, the iPhone came out, things like that, we started to see that become more prevalent, and the scale of these kinds of problems start to grow. An early one would be like banking, hacking, but then as social media took off and things like that, we started to have these sorts of problems. And so I want to talk to you about a piece that I've written called Weaponized Design, on Weaponized Design, and it's based around a concept called Weaponized Design. But before we do that, I want to take a step back from that and talk a little bit about some scenarios that have happened. So last year, Snapchat released a feature called Snap Maps. And here's what it looks like. Essentially, you have an interface on your phone, you opt into this, and then every time you sign into Snapchat, it then broadcasts your location when you snap to someone else, broadcasts your location to everybody on your contact list. And there's a user step process that you explicitly opt into this. But essentially the thrust of it is, yes, every time you log in, your location is broadcast to everybody on your contact list. And quickly what happened was there was this report that a person from The Verge managed to take that and track one of her friends down on Snapchat and actually find her home address. And then she reached out as part of the story that she wrote on this feature and got a quote. And her friend basically said, "That's so creepy. I don't know why anyone would use that. I don't understand how this actually works. And if you're at an event and checking in, I understand that, but I don't want people to see what I'm doing all the time." And in fact, what was happening was users were starting to use this feature, but they weren't actually realizing that every time they opened the app, they were actually broadcasting the location. And so in many cases, such as the use cases that the Snapchat team didn't consider. So for example, the Snapchat team was assuming that everybody on your contact list was a close friend, right? But then people were using it to as like sex workers online, or people were public figures online, or semi-public figures, or influencers online, and things like that. And what this was doing was actually putting them at risk in a way that hadn't really been considered by the design team. And there wasn't, even though there was a way of opting out, it wasn't really the scope or the scale of a leak like this, a personal leak of your information, is vastly more dangerous and more important to address than the feature opt out, like the interface had actually accounted for. So that caused a kerfuffle, and the Snapchat team basically rolled it back a little bit, and then the police issued a warning, and there was like a big front page news everywhere. A second example of that is Twitter. So last year in 2017 again, Twitter Safety rolled out this idea that you would only get notifications that matter. And as part of that, they said that you won't be notified when you're added to a list. So if one user adds you to a list of a collection of users, you won't get that notification. But the problem with that was that people were using that. So people who targeted online for harassment are actually using this feature, this notification, to tell when trolls or harassers were actually adding them to lists that they were then sharing with other harassers. And so this caused, as you can see in this screenshot, an outpouring of outrage at this feature. And then essentially, literally within hours of rolling this out, they shut it down pretty much straight away and removed that feature entirely. A third example I want to give you is this one, which I'm going to have to jump onto YouTube to, or I can basically just walk us through it actually. Unfortunately, this has sound, but I can just walk it through it. So this is a video called Digital Polarization on Pinterest, also taken from 2017. And in it, the fellow here who's the author of this video creates a Pinterest account. And this is a basic Pinterest account. He's picked a couple of things like food and gardening and things like that. And he's just browsing around, and he's like, well, I have a kid. I want to know more about vaccines. So I pin this, and I'm going to add it to a board called vaccines. And this will go with my quiche recipes and my all of these cocktail recipes and things like that. And as he interacts with Pinterest from a brand new account, as soon as he starts clicking on things, the algorithm behind Pinterest starts to get more and more conspiratorial and kind of crazy, right? And so what happens is we go from easy chicken recipes to the H1N1 vaccine is like going to kill you, like in a matter of about 2 minutes. And so as he continues through this, he sort of tracks how, like, if you save even one other pin, so we're now on the second pin, suddenly we're like deep in fluoride, anti-fluoride stuff, and sort of, oh, we've got Parmesan spaghetti, but here we go. Now we've got how much mercury is in a flu shot, right? So suddenly we've gone from this brand new Pinterest account where I'm interested in food and gardening to a full-blown agenda-pushing conspiratorial kind of concept. And it goes on from there. And at the end of it, by the time he gets to the end of this video, he clicks on a link, and he goes from this to this in a matter of 2 minutes and 44 seconds. So that's pretty scary. These are all examples of a concept called weaponized design, which is this idea that it's a phenomena that happens when a design is used to harm, or a platform is used to harm users in ways in which operate completely within the constraints of the designer's intentions. So unlike a hack or some kind of breach, weaponized design only really occurs completely when the system is behaving as normal. And this is a really important distinction, because what it means is that unlike a hack where there's an element of malice on a third party, and it's a lot harder to sort of predict, in many cases the people who are victims of weaponized design are often just going about their business and operating a digital product in the way that it's intended, and often they get absolutely blindsided by it. It's important to note, though, that like there's 3 different ways in which I think design can be weaponized, but I'm going to go through those in a second. But what I really want to talk about as well is a bit of the history of how weaponized design comes about, and why design itself is kind of complicit in this, and why we sort of, I think, need to, I guess, reflect a little bit. So in the late 90s, in the early 90s, Apple hired Donald Norman, who was a behavioral psychologist, or a psychologist, and he formed in competition with Xerox PARC, who were a interface team at Xerox in the 80s and the 70s, and who sort of pioneered the GUI, the graphical user interface. Apple's team, which was sort of founded in this idea of bringing behavioral science and cognitive science together with aesthetics and design, forms the sort of basis of essentially the UI, UX, and its related design fields. And so this team is sort of quite groundbreaking, right? They deliver the UI, they deliver this idea of understanding user mental models and things like that, and it's all based in this kind of synthesis of aesthetics and information architecture and behavioral psychology and medicine. But today, you don't really need that background, right? You don't need to have any kind of medical training or psychology training or any kind of understanding of the human mind at an academic level, or the behavior of humans at a social level, in order to actually become a designer. And in many ways, that's really good, right? Because it means that the floodgates have opened, and it's a democratized kind of industry where anybody can come and learn and become a designer, and that's really, really good in many ways. But the problem is that the systems that we use are these elements of ourselves. They enable self-expression, they enable digital identity and the identity of self online. And so the problem is that because we've started from this base point, the concepts of behavioral psychology and the interaction between each other and this kind of stuff, it still lingers. And yet we have no framework really to deal with this on a design, especially in popular Silicon Valley design. We don't really require the same level of understanding or responsibility as you would in other medical fields, for example. Indeed, design itself at a popular level is obsessed with things like data-driven product decision-makings, design inspiration, 7 logo design trends for 2018. The actual popular, even today, the popular discussion in design still sits at a very surface level, and it's sort of very much obsessed around practice and how to improve the tools that we use, rather than sort of really digging deep into what's going on and whether or not our practice is actually responsible for anything particularly heinous. I want to point out too that this is not about dark UX patterns. A dark UX pattern is this idea that this is an example where you have a user choice where you're trying to push users into something that doesn't benefit them directly. So as you can see here, there's different kinds of reward gift cards, but then you can like decline any kind of decline the bonus subscription, and it's kind of hidden away because the business doesn't want you, the business goals don't want you to as a designer to actually account for that. So you have to sort of bury it and push. Your metric is to push as many of these subscriptions as possible. Dark UX patterns are about making a user or helping a user make a choice they might not necessarily want, like the inability to cancel a subscription because the interface is too confusing in an otherwise beautiful app. Whereas weaponized design is about actual harm that happens to users within this context of the designed interface. And really, I think it comes down to a particular mindset, which is emphasized or is illustrated perfectly in Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think. So this is a mid-90s book about web accessibility and usability. And Steve Krug in this is a very popular book. He has these sort of central thesis, which is that don't make me think. Don't make me think. It doesn't matter how many times I have to click, as long as each click is a mindless, unambiguous choice, and get rid of half of the words on each page and then get rid of half of what's left. So in saying all of these things, what this mindset that sort of became quite popular is that we should design for the most simplest context possible and decontextualize every possible alternative within the lived experience of a user actually using a piece of software. But the problem is that these kinds of systems, it doesn't really hold up in real life, and we're sort of beginning to reap the concepts of the results of this kind of thinking, this idea of super simple designs, focusing on buttons and what makes a good design, flat UI, things like this, the aesthetics over and simplified user flows over deep understanding of the social impacts of this kind of work. This is really why we're at this point right now. So let's talk a little bit about weaponized design. There's three, as I said before, three main ways in which design can be weaponized. The first is by a trade-off conflict. And trade-off conflict is where you design for your ideal user using the kinds of methods that Steve Krug and people like that have described and propose. And in doing so, you make these trade-offs in your system that then come back to haunt you later because you've only designed for an ideal user and not for the intricacies and the political realities of that user. A super good example of this is Apple, in particular in 2014. there was an event called the Fappening, or the iCloud photo hack, in which a huge number of compromising photos were dumped on the internet from iCloud, many of them celebrities, but not all of them. And the reason why this happened was because Apple had made a design trade-off based on word that they were getting that people were losing their phones and obviously all of their photos that they'd taken. So they introduced with iCloud the ability to photo share and just like upload everything on your camera roll. But in doing that, the designers made this conscious decision that users of their services don't sext and they don't take compromising photos or nudes, or they don't express themselves sexually on the internet. And like, that's actually, sorry to take a dig at Apple, but that's like a really weird thing that Apple has throughout all of their products, where they have this hardline stance on sexuality within their platform. And what that means is that when they designed iCloud and people consented through a single button to upload everything to the cloud, they had no idea really that they were actually going to upload everything they took, including selfies. And there's no way that you could make informed consent about that. And then as you're taking photos, be like, and expressing yourself, be like, well, clearly I'm totally okay with this. I'm not thinking about the cloud when that's, people aren't thinking about the cloud when that's happening. And as a result, this is an extremely traumatic and violent event that happened to particularly women, many women who basically use the internet and iCloud. Another way that design can be weaponized is through team apathy or inertia. And there's really two ways in which this happens. The first one, which is kind of my favorite, even though it's really horrible, is this kind of clash between the lived experiences and the design intention of a user. So in 2014, but this has happened a couple of times, Facebook, at the end of every year, if you have a Facebook account, you're probably familiar with this, they release an end of year celebration. And the problem is that like, they curate all of your photos and they show you like a best of your, and they try to use their algorithms to determine what you're going to look fondly upon. So in this photo, we have, as a Happy New Year for 2014, we have a prominent web developer in the top left-hand side whose daughter died that year. Underneath that, we have a dog who died that year. On the top right, we have the ashes of someone's father. And in the bottom right, we have someone's house on fire. And this is meant to be like a, hey, what a good year. This is what your year looked like. That Facebook's design team published this in its current state in that year without any kind of ability to sort of allow people to opt in rather than opt out, to me betrays a serious lack of understanding or empathy of their user base. And indeed, it's this apathy that leads to these kinds of experiences. And you see this kind of clash all the time. Even on things like iCloud, again, the Photos app will show you, if you've got a modern iPhone, it tries to use machine learning to give you memories, and sometimes those are really horrible as well. Especially when it comes to algorithm, this kind of apathy that we have as designers really allows us to relive trauma when we're, because not everybody is like living their best lives online. The guy who's the author, the web developer, his name's Eric Mayer. His daughter, he went through a very public loss of his daughter, and he quoted, he wrote when this happened about this experience, and he says, algorithms are essentially thoughtless. They model certain decision flows, but once you run them, no more thought occurs. To call a person thoughtless is usually considered a slight or an outright insult, and yet we unleash so many literally thoughtless processes on our users, on our lives, on ourselves. In creating this year in review app, there wasn't enough thought given to cases like mine or anyone who had a bad year. The design for the ideal user, the happy, the upbeat, good life user, it doesn't take other uses into account. The other way design apathy can actually happen is through Twitter, and this is an artist rendition of Twitter. It's basically a trash fire. And part of that is because of the perceived indifference of the design team. I showed you an example after many years of harassment through Gamergate, and increasingly in the, Gamergate, when I wrote on Weaponized Design, was like the biggest thing that had happened on Twitter so far. And then of course, here we are 4 months later, and it's like even worse. So Twitter in particular has this big problem, and it's often seen because it's such a juggernaut and they didn't consider a lot of these problems to begin with, or at least they rolled out in a certain way. They're often interpreted as like this kind of apathy, like because the scale is so large, there's like this feeling of apathy, even though internally the design team might have a lot of issues because of the scale of the app. But because of that apathy at the beginning, they're sort of locked into this trajectory now. Here's another example of how Twitter can basically take even the smallest steps and mess it up. So verification was meant to authenticate identity and voice, but it is interpreted as an endorsement or an indicator of importance. We recognize that we have created this confusion and we need to resolve it. We have therefore paused all general verifications while we work and will report back soon. So even their fundamental concepts, I mean, at one point, in the early days of Twitter, you could go to popular restaurants or clubs in big cities and use your verified status to get into nightclubs. And then here we are in 2017 in November, and Twitter's like, oh, actually, we didn't realize that that was what people actually use this tick for. So the third one is conscious weaponization and persuasion. And I apologize, this is meant to be for a wider screen. And conscious weaponization is kind of a lot more deliberate and a little bit more insidious and very, very relevant now. But it's often, the design teams are often left out of that discussion. If you think about Zuckerberg's discussion or testimony in front of Congress, a lot of the questions were around free speech. There wasn't a lot around the design of the interfaces and how that participates in the outcomes that we have today. So for example, how creepy is this article from 2017, evolving the Facebook newsfeed to serve you better, when not 1 year later, Mark Zuckerberg was in front of Congress testifying about how the newsfeed was like messing with the American election. So here's an example of a piece where the design team at Facebook were making small tweaks that were resulting in massive engagement increases, and working alongside data scientists to kind of draw people in with engagement, which is, you know, fundamentally what they're employed to do. But without the context of what's going on and without sort of thinking about the larger scale ramifications of having people always on your on newsfeed, you know, this was happening at the same time as people already talking about the kinds of issues that Facebook was having with the publishing of fake media, fake news. I hate that term, but anyway. But as you can see, like within a year, there's a giant scandal about basically Cambridge Analytica, and then by extension, the gaming of Facebook's newsfeed in order to sort of sway public opinion. So there's three, as I said, there's three separate ways in which design can be weaponized, and I'm pretty sure that I'm going to run out of time very soon. So what I want to do now is just talk very quickly. How much time do I have? No? Okay. All right. So what I want to do is, I don't want this to be about just railing on the design community. I mean, I am, someone in the audience said that they're angry and curious, and I am exactly the same way. I'm really angry about this. But I don't want to just give criticism and say that we as designers have failed collectively. I want to actually talk about different ways in which we can improve this. So the first one is to design for politics and not personas. So what I mean by that is essentially criticizing a particular tool that we use in our practice, which is user stories. And with a user story, you typically take an ideal user and you create this user. It's like a focus group or something like that. You create an ideal user that's made up of attributes. But in doing so, we decontextualize their lived experiences. So we might have a 30-year-old who has 2 kids and a spouse, and we might have some of their economic details or some of their wants and needs and the tasks they want to accomplish. But we have no idea of like their political contexts, not their beliefs, but their actual context, like the way that they live and how they operate in society. And so because, as you can see here in this screenshot, user stories are task-based, it means that we can never examine the motivations, the true motivations behind it, or the results of those tasks in a greater system. If you think about design as a systems design or user interface design as like a layer in a systems design and infrastructure project, then really user stories start to sort of make less sense. Indeed, one way to solve this is through participatory design, which is where you start to bring stakeholders and users together, and you start to examine the roles and needs of everybody, but then also compare them to each other. A lot of the work, it can seem really daunting that to sort of look at the infrastructural implications of what we're working on. But the truth is that this work has already been done in multiplayer games. So designers who work on massive multiplayer online games have done a lot of this work already, because their goal, as is anybody who works on a project, is engagement and return use. These people care intrinsically about the interactions between people within a system, within a modeled system. And so there's a lot, I feel, to be learned from participatory design and games design, particularly where people come together and experience a product together, that we can all learn from in the design community. The second way is designing for the worst case scenario. And there's a really interesting concept behind this. I think that by saying that we're going to be ethical designers, I mean, I don't want to be too critical of the word ethical. I think that ethical allows us, it's a fine line between a good intention and like a sort of stepping back from responsibility. But to me, what I'm interested in is the ethics side of things, but also the responsibility side of things. And a big part of that is looking at ways that we can diversify our experience and actually design for the worst case scenario. And in any team, especially any mid-sized or larger team, the easiest way is to think of the security team as UX designers. So a product security team makes terrible UX to keep people out. And a product team makes great UX to keep people in. And to me, these two jobs are exactly the same from totally different perspectives. And so what I would really love to see, and what I'm really excited about, is this idea that we can actually work together. And I would love to see security teams working in tandem completely with a design team. To me, that would make a massive difference in product design. The third way is to codify conduct and outcomes. We talked a little bit before about the code of conduct we have here, and there's also code of conduct, codes of conduct in open source communities. I believe someone at the back mentioned this as well. And another thing that I think that we should think about is a code of outcomes. If you think about how, as the design community has become more diverse and become more accepting, we have a lot of work to go, a lot of work to do still, but we have started, one of the ways in which we've started making this progress is by having code of conducts and adhering and policing the environments that we have and making sure that they're a lot more welcoming. And I think that we can do the same with the technology that we produce, that we actually examine as we produce either open source or closed source, the outcomes and examine those as part of our work and as part of policing our own environment and our own industry. I think that if we had some kind of self-regulation in that kind of respect, this would go a long way to sort of forcing people to start thinking about the ways in which design can be used to harm users. This is a really long quote, but I want to finish up with that and open it up for questions. So this is Donald Norman from Apple. And he had this really great quote that I think is amazing. So when people fail to follow these bizarre secret rules and the machine does the wrong thing, its operators are blamed for not understanding the machine, for not following its rigid specifications. With everyday objects, the result is frustration. With complex devices and commercial and industrial processes, the resulting difficulties can lead to accidents, injuries, and even deaths. It's time to reverse the situation and to cast blame upon the machines and their design. It is the machine and its design that are at fault. I think this can be summarized by the next part of the quote. It is the duty of the machine and those who design them to understand people. It is not our duty to understand the arbitrary, meaningless dictates of machines. Thank you very much.